Hello, this is John Hesse, Cahokia Presbyterian Church. Glad to have you watching and listening, and I hope that you enjoy this story and that it's a blessing to you. We're reading from Wise Words by Peter Leithart, and the story is A Reluctant Rescue. Once upon a time, a king named Abraham ruled a beautiful kingdom. His father had been a mighty warrior and had killed many dragons and driven the rest out of the land. Because of his father, Abraham inherited a land of peace and plenty. During his second year as king, Abraham married the most beautiful princess in the world, whose name was Sarah, at the most gorgeous wedding there had ever been. They were going to live happily ever after, as kings and queens are said to do at the end of fairy tales, or so they thought. In the dark kingdom on the other side of the mountain lived an evil king. He too had wanted to marry Princess Sarah, but Abraham had won her heart. As a result, the evil king became angry and bitter, and over the years his bitterness grew and grew. As often happens with bitter people, the king's appearance began to change. He lost his hair, his skin hardened into scales, his teeth became as sharp as razors, and he grew a tail. His fingers curled into claws, and he walked through his castle on all fours. Bat-like wings sprouted from his back. One morning when he looked into the mirror, he had turned completely into a dragon. Still, his bitterness burned and bubbled inside him, and great puffs of smoke and fire billowed from his nostrils. Of course, not all bitter people turn into dragons, but most do. All the while, the Dragon King planned his revenge. Abraham had taken what he loved, so Abraham would have to pay. Night after night, the dragon crouched on the hill overlooking Abraham's castle, angrily breathing fire and looking for a chance to seize Sarah. His chance came late on a moonless summer night. Unaware of the danger, King Abraham had taken his best men into the forest for 2 weeks of hunting. The castle had been left under the protection of the fat butler and the thin cook, who, though sturdy and brave, were no match for a cunning and powerful dragon. Sarah had just blown out the candle and settled down in bed when something glided through her open window, and an awful odor filled the room. A claw closed over her face. She struggled and tried to scream, but could not free herself. In the light of the dragon's fiery breath, she saw his horrible grinning face and fainted. When she awoke, she was in the dungeon of the Dragon King's castle. In the dim light, she could see rats and insects crawling across the floors and the walls. The Dragon King gazed through the bars of her cell. "Perhaps," he hissed, "perhaps now you will be my queen, and we shall have children of our own." Terrified by the dragon, and a little sickened by the smell of death on his breath, she fell crying to the floor. When Abraham returned from his hunt, he found the cook and the butler moaning and weeping in the kitchen. All they knew was that Queen Sarah had disappeared mysteriously in the night. Searching his lands, Abraham learned from some of the peasants that a strange creature carrying a heavy burden had been seen flying east on the very night the queen was taken. As a boy, Abraham listened eagerly to his father's stories about fighting dragons. But he thought all the dragons had been killed and that his land was free from danger. He had hoped to live his life happily and peacefully, without trouble and strife. He wanted to lie in bed at daybreak, watching the beams of morning sunlight stream across his queen's lovely face. He wanted to romp in the castle yard with his sons after supper. He wanted to spend his days helping the peasants who came to him in pain and sorrow and need, and to enjoy his Sabbaths amid the heavenly echoes of the chapel. What he did not want to do was to fight a dragon. He'd never even seen a dragon, even though he was a king, and kings normally see more dragons than the rest of us. Besides, he told himself, he was not a mighty warrior like his father. He was a man of peace, not a man of violence. He was a man of love, not a man of war. He'd rather give up his crown than fight a dragon. And yet, he reminded himself, my queen has been taken. She may be wounded. I must rescue her, but What can I do against a dragon? Filled with confusion and gloom, King Abraham walked into the castle garden and fell on his knees. "Oh, Lord," he groaned, "if it is possible, take this from me, free my beloved, and bring her safely home." As he prayed, King Abraham thought he heard a rumbling voice saying a language that sounded like Latin, "Take up the book and read." Raising his eyes, he saw a small, thick book lying on the garden bench. It belonged to Augustine, the master who tutored Abraham's 2 sons. Trembling, he opened the book, and his eyes fastened on these words: "The violence of death can none avoid who is born mortal. So also against the violence of love can the world do nothing. For as death is most violent to take away, so love is most violent to save." Love is most violent to save. The words hit Abraham like a club. He said the words over and over in his mind. Love is most violent to save, tingling with a strange mixture of joy and fear. Abraham stuffed the book into his shirt. Setting his face like flint, he slipped his favorite sword into his belt, mounted his horse, and rode out the castle gate toward the east, his mind full of the words he had just read. Love is most violent to save. It was already dark when he arrived at the gates of the Dragon King's castle. High up in one of the black towers, he could see the light of a flickering fire. Abraham dismounted and crept toward the gate. Suddenly, he felt something tear at his face and head. It clawed at the purple robe he was wearing and tried to trip him. Frantically, Abraham stepped back, drew his sword, and peered at his invisible adversary. As the full moon broke through the clouds, he saw the castle gate was blocked by thorns. He struck at the thorns with his sword, but they were too tough to cut. Yet he knew if he were going to rescue his queen, he would have to struggle through this wall, this sea of thorns. Covering his face as best as he could, Abraham bent down and pushed through. Several times he slipped and his knees were slashed. His hands and head and face were scratched and bleeding. His royal robe torn to shreds. After what seemed like hours, he crawled through the last of the thorns and found himself in the entranceway, which branched out into 3 main hallways of the castle. He had no sooner stood up and wiped the blood from his eyes than the room was filled with a blaze of fire. Abraham scrambled behind a pillar. When he looked around it, he saw the Dragon King walking toward him down the center hallway. At the sight, Abraham's heart stopped. The Dragon King was nearly as long as the hallway. His red scales glistened despite the darkness. Nothing his father had said could have prepared Abraham for his first sight of a real live dragon. Gathering his courage, Abraham stepped from behind the pillar and raised his sword. "I have come to rescue my queen," he announced, in the bravest voice he could muster under the circumstances. Now the dragon saw him for the first time. Cocking his head to one side, he looked at Abraham with hatred and mockery in his eyes. "Ha!" he said, as a cloud of smoke poured from his nostrils. "Who do you think I am, coming out with that little toothpick? Come a little closer and I'll turn you into food for my pets." Swallowing hard, King Abraham tried to speak. His voice squeaked. He cleared his throat and started again. You are stronger than I. It's true," he said in a quavering voice, "but you have only the violence of death, so you can only take away. I have the violence of love. The violence of love is unconquerable. Love is violent to save." With a roar, the dragon opened his jaws and breathed out a flood of white-hot fire. As Abraham leaped behind the pillar, he felt the blazing heat at his back. When he looked down at his sword, he saw that it had melted to nothing. "What will you do now, King Abraham?" the dragon sneered. "Even your sword is no good to you." Abraham knew he had little hope of saving Sarah, much less himself. He tried to think of a way to trick the dragon, but in the terror of the moment, he could think of nothing. A knife! Perhaps he'd brought a knife. He fumbled at his belt. No knife. Perhaps his spurs would help, but he left home in such haste that he'd forgotten to wear them. He felt something hard at his breast. Reaching into his shirt, he pulled out Augustine's book. "What good is a book against a dragon?" he murmured fearfully. "I cannot read him to death." Just at that moment, the bell in the huge tower clock began to chime the midnight hour. Startled by the sound, the Dragon King looked behind him. At the same instant, Abraham started to run down a hallway. The dragon was close behind him. Desperate, King Abraham stopped, turned, threw Augustine's book toward the dragon with all of his might, then ran off down the hallway. Now, Abraham did not know it, although his father would have, but certain species of dragons have a weakness. They have a soft spot directly on top of their head. Everywhere else, their scales are like armor, but they can be killed by the slightest blow to that one spot. The problem is, however, it is terribly hard to get close enough to a dragon to hit his soft spot. As you've probably guessed, the Dragon King was exactly the right kind of a dragon. And Augustine's book hit the dragon in exactly the right spot. The dragon spun around 4.5 times, which is customary, breathed a great cloud of stinking black smoke, and fell to the floor, dead. Dead as a dragon, as the saying goes. King Abraham stayed hidden for a long time, watching to make sure that the dragon really was dead. When he was certain, he went through the castle to find Sarah. After a long search, he found her in the dungeon cell with many of the dragon's victims. King Abraham released them all. When they had found their way back to the castle gate, the wall of thorns had vanished. The sun was rising and filling the world with light and warmth. Taking his queen's hand, the king led the released prisoners back over the mountains to the west, back home to his castle. There he invited them all to stay for a great feast of Thanksgiving. This time, Abraham and Sarah truly did live happily ever after. And the moral is from Proverbs 20, verse 26. A wise king winnows the wicked and drives the threshing wheel over them. And thank you very much for your time. God bless you.